This is Talking Ears. I'm Frank Wardinger, music audiologist in Philadelphia.
And I'm Juan Vasquez, music audiologist in Chicago.
And welcome back to the office hours. It's nice to be here in the office hours with you, Juan, talking about something that is rather delicate and interesting, but also, I think, actually kind of fun to talk about because it's something that is a little bit confusing for folks.
I think it's more than anything super important. Today we're going to be talking about effective stage monitoring with hearing loss. And this includes a topic that is quite popular, not just in the music community, but also into the audiology community, in-ear monitors.
This talk, I think the best way we're going to frame it is that we're directing it towards musicians and performers, especially stage performers, who actually have a hearing loss themselves. Mm-hmm. But most of the questions that I get about this are not somebody saying, hey, how do I monitor and adjust monitoring for myself with my own hearing loss? It's usually from monitor engineers or people working with the artist saying, I want to support this individual who has hearing loss, but all I've got is an audiogram. It looks like an EQ curve. Do I just flip it upside down? Help. So this is the help. I have a lot of stuff that I want to cover, and I wrote an article for the website that this is going to accompany. But what I was hoping to do with you, Juan, is to unpack a little bit of it in a more conversational way, because sometimes reading these things on page can be very sleep-inducing. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the technical level of this conversation might not match the reader's technical level, so hopefully we can talk through some of these things in a way that makes them a little bit more palatable and even give some audio examples throughout. So the first thing to point out is that folks with hearing loss still hear quite a lot, especially at the intensities that we're talking about at stage level. So when you have a person with hearing loss who has an audiogram, or when you're looking at your own audiogram, that does not tell us how you're hearing when music or when signals are quite loud. So we're going to talk about what the audiogram is, and more importantly, what it isn't, what it's not showing. I also think it's going to be important to talk about some of the other barriers that happen psychoacoustically with our ears. And then finally, we're going to get into some of the solutions. There's some kind of traditional mixing solutions that I want to share from my experience as a monitoring and front of house engineer, how to actually address this for performers with hearing loss, both some technology options that you might not have heard of or might not be using in this way, as well as some more traditional mixing solutions, which we all use when we're just creating a decent mix. But we're going to consider how these affect a person with hearing loss.
Well, someone with hearing loss, a performer with hearing loss, what are those aspects? What are those things that we need to take a look at or consider?
So there's a lot of different kind of, I think of them as goals, right? When you step up on stage, you want to be able to hear what you're performing and your own portions of it, right? You play guitar and you sing. So if you are playing guitar and singing a song up by yourself in front of an audience, you're not going to be able to do that without hearing your signals from your microphone, from your instrument. So that's going to be the first and foremost signal that people need. And people with hearing loss, they may be able to hear what is coming out of their instruments and what's coming out of their voices. But depending on the stage monitoring, it may muddy that water or make it difficult for them to hear it as clearly as they would have before. So that's probably the most important one.
Something that's clear and functional, basically. Something that we all kind of want when we're on stage performing is getting that mix and making sure that we are sounding the way that we want to. So finding that balance, I suppose.
Exactly. You have to hear first and foremost yourself, right? In order to know that you're doing the right thing, right?
Yeah.
Get that biofeedback. If I hear that the song is in G and I can hear that I'm playing in G, all is good. If I hear that the song is in G and I notice that, my finger slipped down a fret or something and oops, F sharp or A flat shouldn't be in there. Then you can react accordingly, and most people don't even notice that you made a little flub-a-dub with your fingers. But if you can't hear that you're doing it, that's when things go off the rails, and you have bands where, two people are playing in different keys or out of time with each other because they're not hearing the aspect that is supposed to be keeping them or cueing them.
With someone with hearing loss on stage, certainly they need to hear themselves, but also other members of the ensemble.
True.
So making sure that there's still that connection that is a challenge for folks with hearing loss as they're performing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you're sharing the stage with other people, you're having to care about and listen to and be aware of what everybody else is doing. And maybe this is a good moment to mention, too, that when we talk about hearing loss, there's not only different types of hearing loss, but also each person's experience with that hearing loss varies drastically. Any recommendation or solution or advice for one individual's hearing may actually not work at all for the next person. Even if they're in the same band, even if their audiogram looks very similar, it's an extremely individualized experience.
Right.
So yeah, be able to connect with the different members of the ensemble, which is also extremely varied, right? Yeah. Two bands that play the same music might have different components to their ensemble, but if we were to think just in a traditional rock setting, which might be a fair place to start with this conversation, we have drums, acoustic drums, we have maybe an electric bass, maybe an electric guitar or two, maybe some keyboards, and likely more than one vocalist. Right, maybe a lead and a couple backup vocals. And depending on your role in that band, you may need different mixes of all of that stuff to be able to do what you need to do and to have a good time while you're doing it.
Right.
Because it's not just about the function when you're on stage. It's also about the experience and the art and the creation element too.
And I think that is something that has some weight to this, is having not just a connection with your own mix and your ensemble and how you sound in the group and what you're creating, but the reaction of the audience as well.
That's huge.
I think that's something that is so important, is the connection with oneself to the room. That includes the audience and the reaction. It's this kind of not give and take. It's sort of this ebb and flow.
Symbiotic relationship almost.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship between...
Or parasitical. Depending on the artist or the audience. There's a great image, and I think we'll add it into the article to clarify this, but it's from one of our heroes, Brian Eno, who described that art is the thing that happens between the artist and the audience. It's that space in between them, that Venn diagram crossing over and creating this experience that is not just from the artist, right? The artist in an empty room isn't, unfortunately, sharing art. So the idea of being able to hear the audience, being able to hear not just that they're there, but also that they're clapping along, right, during the song, maybe singing along during the song, maybe cheering, maybe booing, maybe reacting, maybe laughing, right? All of those audience interactions are in no small way why we perform, right? Why most performers do it. It's the thing that gives them the energy and the joy and the fuel to do it every night. So the person with hearing loss, the performer with hearing loss, may be not only disconnected from their instrument or having trouble being connected to their ensemble, but especially those people who may be 30, 40, 60 feet away from them, the audience, and how can we bring them back into the experience as well for that person?
It's about connection, this nice, clear signal from what the artist with hearing loss is hearing, their interaction with the room, then the connection with the audience. making sure it's a musical and pleasing sound to be part of.
Absolutely. I think the one other thing that is important to highlight is that folks with or without hearing loss are at risk for losing their hearing due to consistent exposure to loud sound. This is what we talk about until we're blue in the face. But just because a person has hearing aids or hearing loss or wears amplification doesn't mean they're immune to this. In fact, I don't know if you agree with this, but I would say that folks with hearing loss, it's almost more important that we care about hearing loss prevention, or in this case, hearing conservation, to make sure that their hearing loss doesn't progress unnecessarily. Right? We can mitigate all of those reasons why they may need, for instance, stronger hearing aids, or progressing to cochlear implants, or being unhappy with the amount of hearing that they may have left going away.
Basically preserving what they have and making sure that they're not negatively affecting their hearing by doing what they love doing or participating in that activity, that creative process of music making.
Correct. Yeah. And it's mission critical for folks without hearing loss, folks with hearing within the normal range. But for folks with hearing loss, little changes and decreases to your remaining hearing, it's a pretty terrible analogy in the sense that it's triggering, but I think of a plane that has two engines, and if one engine goes down, the importance of that other engine becomes infinitely more, right? It no longer is one of the two engines, it's now the only engine. And with hearing loss, when you lose some of your hearing, that remaining hearing is just increases in its importance, and why we want to preserve that.
With someone with hearing loss who performs on stage, who is in a very demanding and critically listening musical situation, what are some barriers that come about with these situations and these environments?
So the first one is something that you and I can talk about, and we do talk about with patients all the time, which is that sensorineural hearing loss, which is the typical type of hearing loss that comes from noise exposure. Sensorineural hearing loss is the more common type of hearing loss with adults. There's also this other type called conductive hearing loss, which happens in adults as well as kids, and it might be more common in kids. We might talk about that type a little bit later, but we're going to focus on sensorineural for now as sort of the main thing that we're discussing. Sensorineural hearing loss is not just a loss of your ability to hear quiet sounds. It often also interferes with your ability to hear loud sounds, right? So we talk about a reduced dynamic range with folks who have hearing aids, and this also affects the ability for you on stage to be able to squeeze in all those audio sources that we just talked about, your own instruments, the rest of the ensemble, the audience. We're squeezing them into a smaller range, a smaller dynamic range. So how do we handle that with hearing aids?
Well, with hearing aids, we help to boost the portion of their ear to make sure that they're getting a clearer signal. At the same time, there's some compression to make sure that loud sounds aren't too loud. And so things are just kind of squeezed in a little bit into this range that will fit and work with this person. With that said, sometimes it may sound a little different. Over time, there's that period to acclimate, but there is always going to be this part of it that it's not going to be the same as it was too.
I use this imagery of a tunnel, driving a big car or a big truck or something through a tunnel, that the floor of the tunnel is the threshold of hearing. And as you develop hearing loss, that threshold rises up, right? The floor gets worse,
right?
Rises up, and no longer you have that same space. But with sensorineural hearing loss, the ceiling also comes down. In audio terms, we call that clipping, right? When the top of an audio signal, the loudest parts of it are being cut off or limited. In hearing terms, your ear doesn't go through this nice sounding clipping or nice sounding transparent limiting like we use in audio. Instead, you just get hurt. It feels bad. It's painful. So we call it recruitment. You might also hear the term hyperacusis or loudness intolerance. We've talked about all of these on the show. And this happens with anybody with sensorineural hearing loss. It's a little bit hard to predict which frequencies it's going to happen at more, but it's a pretty easy thing to say that the more hearing loss somebody has in the sensorineural domain, the more chances that recruitment and hyperacusis and loudness intolerance will be going along with those frequencies.
And with the sensorineural hearing loss, this is the type of hearing loss that is permanent. There's no surgery, medication that'll bring back the hearing to what it once was. With an artist with sensorineural hearing loss, what is it like on stage?
So on stage, and anybody who's ever performed on stage will agree with this, it's very hard to hear through the mess. Mm-hmm. It feels like everything is loud and yet you can't hear anything sometimes.
Yeah,
it's the weird experience with that. The room itself may be causing some of that, just the reflections of the room, the background noise, even the audience just talking can create this noise floor that makes it very tough for you to hear through it all.
Yeah.
So we often talk about the need for control of the mix.
Okay. Yeah.
For an individual with hearing loss, we will also want that control to be very consistent, where every time that they step out on stage, they're not reinventing the wheel.
Right.
And this is just hard to do from room to room, from venue to venue. Mm-hmm. And most performers in the world do not have a dedicated monitor engineer. They're doing it on their own, or they're reliant on a front of house engineer who might not know anything about their music or anything about their hearing for that matter. This is the first trial by fire for an individual who's performing and has hearing loss. Just stepping into the venue and recognizing that it's going to be a different set of acoustic challenges every night.
And I can imagine for that individual, it can feel very, very challenging. Just being in that tough situation where their own hearing may be not quite what it used to be. And then every night it's a different space altogether, maybe working with a different front of house engineer. And that can add in maybe a little bit of stress. And I don't know, for me, that would potentially affect my creative process for sure. And so with that reduced dynamic range and those challenges to varying venues, the way that the mix is coming out, either from wedge monitors or in-ear monitors, what are some ways that we can make it a little bit easier? Or how can we make sure that this artist with a hearing loss can have a much more positive experience with what they have?
The solutions are varied. The first one is just what you would think of as traditional mix management. What people do and what we've been trained to do and what front of house and monitor engineers are really good at, which is cleaning a mix and making it palatable, making it so that the individual who's receiving the mix, whether it's the audience or the performer, is getting what they want and need. For the performer, it's a functional thing, right? You need these things in order to perform. For the audience, it's much more of a aesthetic thing. I want these things because I want to enjoy the music and I want to hear. So those two things need to be in balance. So we'll talk about some of those traditional mix management things and how we can tweak them for somebody with hearing loss and use the audiogram to inform the use. And then there's two other kind of technologies, actually more than that, but two main ones that I do want to highlight. There's the Sensophonics 3D ME, which we've talked about on this show before. It's an active ambient in-ear monitor system that allows you to EQ and add gain. So essentially turn your in-ear monitors into stage hearing aids, which is a very, very nice feature. And then there's another one that's relatively new to the system. It's not a new company, but Aviom, who makes stage monitors, control units for personal monitoring, has been working on a system to address audiograms and address people with hearing loss directly through the system. So I want to talk a little bit about that because it's a new system.
So on that, someone with hearing loss, how do we know if someone has a hearing loss or a change in their hearing? Well, what we call that are the hearing test results, basically the audiogram. And that's kind of the first step in knowing if there's been a change in hearing, if there's a diagnosed hearing loss. Basically, the audiogram plots each ear's ability to detect the softest level at different test frequencies. Most traditional audiology clinics will test from 250 to 8,000 hertz. You can think of that as the gold standard for an audiogram. Now, for musicians, that probably seems comical just to have a limited window in the entirety of our human ears and hearing. And so part of it is because it's the gold standard throughout audiology and its history, but it's also very sensitive to seeing how it could potentially affect communication with this, basically with speech. But when it comes to music, it's a little different. There are some other considerations that we need to think about in this kind of audiologic sense for musicians.
When we talk about the speech frequencies of 250 to 8,000 hertz, that's not even the full range of speech. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the lowest end of both your and my voice, we're both baritones. We don't have very bassy voices. But the low end of our voices is right around like a G or an F sharp or an F, depending on how early in the morning it is. If we isolated the lowest pitch, it sounds like this. All right, so there's Juan speaking low. And the low end of his voice, when I isolated that, it's about 80 to 100 hertz. That's the lowest sound of most men's voices. Most women's voices, here's an example.
In terms of the access, I wanted to say about Music Cares.
That's fellow music audiologist and friend of the show, Heather Maliek, from a previous episode. And the lowest frequency of her voice is coming in around 150 to 200 hertz. Not much higher than Juan's voice. And then if we look at the highest end of what we can say, it sounds an S. Mm-hmm. That S up there is near 8,000 hertz. But it actually extends up to about 11,000 hertz. It's a pretty high frequency sound. When we talk about the speech range, it's actually more like 80 to 11,000 hertz. Mm-hmm. But the reason why audiology has been hyper-focused on 250 to 8,000 hertz all this time, like you said, Juan, is because of history. And also, we don't really need those extreme highs and lows to understand what someone's saying. So if we take speech, and I'm going to do this to my voice right now, and cut out everything below 250 and above 8K, you'll still hear everything I say. In fact, it won't sound that different if you're listening on headphones or on a phone. It'll only really sound different if you're monitoring in studio monitors like we do, or nice quality headphones, right? But your earbuds might not sound that different. So there you go. That's the speech range. It's enough for us to be able to hear and understand what people are saying without losing any details or losing any speech details.
Part of what a lot of music audiologists do is understand that this specific window of frequencies is meaningful for a lot of musicians, but there are also other test frequencies that can give a little bit more insight and meaning to that individual musician's ears and hearing. So we can actually test extended low and high frequency test results. And so this can actually give us a much bigger picture of an individual's hearing, which can be very, very helpful, sometimes even validating too, depending on the individual case.
So I like to tell people about this, 250 to 8,000 hertz, and then say that as a musician, I want to test all the available frequencies just so you have that information. Because we're used to looking at plots from our speakers that go down to 10 hertz up to 30,000 hertz, even though we can't hear those extremes. We're used to looking at these plots, so we want the same thing for our own hearing profile when we get it tested. So I extend in one octave on either side, and a lot of music audiologists do this as well. So instead of stopping at 250, we go down to 125. We can't go below that because the headphones and the systems just literally don't don't have test frequencies below that, and we can't calibrate it. And then we test up to 16,000 hertz. I know some audiologists who are able to test up to 20,000 hertz or 18,000. My system goes up to 16,000. And beyond that, it's really tough to calibrate. So that's the tricky thing. Now I'll play a music example where I take everything below 250 hertz out and everything above 8,000 hertz out. It might sound fine to your ears until I add in those frequencies again, right? But before I do, let's now add an octave on either side. Let's cut everything below 125 hertz out and everything above 16,000 hertz out. Now it sounds pretty nice. Now let's hear the full range. And with the full range, you get all that sub information that actually makes you want to dance and move, the high information that actually makes it feel like it's in the air and has space around it. And depending on your headphones and your speaker situation, that example might not have been clear, but I encourage you to go back and listen to it with high quality headphones, and you'll get a sense of what we're talking about here with the frequency range limitations.
Great. So that's basically a little rundown of the audiogram. Thanks, Frank, for going a little bit more into that. So
you mean going off on an extreme tangent?
Well, I think that those tangents kind of help weave us into these solutions and these practical ways that we can better understand what it's like, not just for the experience of the artist, but what we can do to support them in their creative process on stage. So one thing to note, too, is that the audiogram only shows thresholds of hearing.
Yeah.
So the softest, lowest levels that we can hear these test tones doesn't necessarily talk about too much on our hearing above that. Mm-hmm. The idea here is that we can hear that, but there's not a whole lot more that simple pure tone test tells us.
I think it's tough because when you look at somebody's hearing test and when somebody receives a hearing test and then they hand you their audiogram and says, "This is my hearing," it's actually not. And I hate to sound like I'm being derogatory towards audiology, but the audiogram is like, it's as much your hearing ability as it is as a test showing whether or not you can see the color red as a test of your vision, right? It's only looking at one thing. It happens to be the most important and sensitive part that we can test, and it's what all of audiology is based on, but it's only looking at your ability to hear at threshold. And we rarely, if ever, in our actual lives and almost never in music are listening at threshold. We're listening upwards at 70, 80, 90, 100 decibels. If your threshold's at 20 or 30 or 40, that almost doesn't say anything about your experience up at full intensity. So what confuses people about the audiogram in this context is that I've had numerous monitoring engineers and musicians ask this question: can't I just take the audiogram, flip it upside down, and add an EQ curve that replaces it? So for instance, if a person has a 30 decibel hearing loss at 4,000 hertz, can't I just add 30 dB of gain to offset this audiogram? Will result in an extremely unlistenable, unmusical response that doesn't actually help the person with hearing loss. Mm-hmm. So how is it that we do this with hearing aids, Juan?
With hearing aids, there's this prescriptive approach. So the way that the hearing aids will traditionally add gain is by a 1/2 or 1/3 gain rule. The goal is to have better audibility without discomfort. So that's in the traditional hearing aid sense, to help better understand speech. Mm-hmm. There are some channels and ways that we can program devices to make the experience a little bit better for music, but still at the same time, it's not quite the same.
Yeah. And that whole 1/3 or 1/2 gain rule is just a starting place, right? Because each person is going to have different sensitivities.
Right.
And then on top of that, we need to consider what we already talked about with the tunnel lowering and the floor rising up and the ceiling lowering. We have a smaller dynamic range, so we need to add that wide dynamic range compression, or WDRC, which essentially for audio engineers out there, it works like our compressors, except the threshold is very low. You might have the threshold set to about 40 decibels of input, which means it's working all the time. But then the ratio will be set at something like 1.5 to 1, so a super low ratio. So it may be working all the time, but it's not applying a lot of compression. It's working a little bit all the time. So that's what we call wide dynamic range compression. You would never use this in a music setting, except when you're trying to mix for somebody with hearing loss. Suddenly it becomes a really smart approach, because you can offset the loudness discomfort or the dynamic range discrepancy that this person has by rising up some of those quiet inputs, while at the same time pushing a little bit on the higher intensity parts of the signal to make that pancake a little bit more narrow, a little bit thinner.
That sounds like we're veering into the possible solutions of what we can do.
It is.
For monitoring, and mixing for folks with the sensorineural hearing loss. So that's one approach, one of those solutions. How about other ways that we can do this with mix management?
The first one I want to mention here is actually just back to a traditional regular mixing suggestion that we all learned when you're first learning how to mix things, which is to consider the certain elements. What elements are we focusing on? I call them focal elements. That would be the lead vocals. If you're in the front of house world, that has to be dominant, or at least on top of everything else. If you're talking about monitoring, that might be yourself, whatever your own role is, and also what you need to hear in order to follow along, such as the leader of the band, or maybe it's the drums, or maybe the guitar. It really depends on the setting and the musical thing. So instead, I'll just define it as the focal sources, the things that are 100% necessary for that individual to hear above all else. And it may be only one or two things, or it may be 10 things. The next one down the list, and there's a great graphic of this on the article, the next one down the list is what I call the reference signals. So these are things that give you cues to rhythm, when you should be playing, how fast the tempo is, how tight the band has to be. So that might be the drums, there might be the bass drum, especially the hi-hat, depending on your style of music, your snare drum, and also pitch references, which are very often bass instruments, bass or rhythm guitars or keyboards. Especially for vocalists, those pitch references are extremely important. One very easy way to throw off a vocalist is to cut out all the bass frequencies from their rhythm instruments, and then suddenly it's really hard to find your pitch because you're not hearing those fundamentals anymore. So using that concept in reverse and saying what this person needs is these clear fundamentals and these clear rhythmic guides so that they know where they are in musical space. And then there's one more layer, which the audience calls the joy of it, the fun of it, the color of it, the excitement of the musical experience. But when you're performing on stage, they might just be distractions. And these are the color elements where, you might have like horn sections that come in briefly, and they're not necessary for your performance or for your ability to do what your job is on stage, but it certainly adds a lot of excitement and joy to the band and to the music overall. A couple other obvious examples of this, like some aux percussion, like maybe a conga player, maybe some shakers, maybe the lead guitar solo. You don't really need to hear that if you're just grooving as the bass player or the drummer. It doesn't need to be the forefront in your mix. Right. In your experience, Juan, you've played in bands on stage, and you've played solo, and you played accompanying folks. Like, what is your experience with this idea of like stratifying the mix elements?
In my experience, the focal sources primarily were the vocalists, making sure that those were the most present. And with the way that I was generally monitored, that's primarily what we needed to hear. The acoustic drums were the loudest thing, and so that was no problem for me in my experience. If anything, the more challenging part was having the mix so that I was able to hear myself better.
Yep.
This was before the time I was able to use any inner monitors or anything like that, but it was kind of a DIY sort of approach with my experience, is to do the best you can to hear yourself. I always had to have that strong urge to resist turning my amp up, so just as many rock guitar players will say.
Yeah.
But anyway, that stereotype aside, that's sort of my experience, is the focal source, the singers, the vocalists, then whatever rhythm or pitch reference, usually like the piano, and then any other color, so to speak, on top of that. Could be like the shakers, sometimes maybe even a click track as far as like that rhythm and pitch reference. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's the nice thing about going to in-ear monitors, especially for people with hearing loss, is they can have access to those cue mixes, those reference tracks, the people who are giving stage cues, for lack of a better word, saying, hey, this is the verse coming up, this is the we're going to stop this song and move on to this one, 3, 2, 1. And clicks and metronomes and things can really keep you on track. And you also brought up another really good point, which is that in most common stage environments, we have a lot of things that are already making a lot of noise, right? Guitar amps, drums, bass amps, horns can, often go through without monitoring because they're quite loud on stage. I don't know if you read this, but I just recently read an article saying that some guitar scientists, after years of research, have found out that volume knobs not only go to the right, but can also be turned to the left.
Wait, is there such a thing?
They're going to have to repeat these studies to make sure that this is a true finding. But I don't want to get off tangent. So yeah, it's a more conscious thought for somebody with hearing loss that we need to make sure that we are pushing forward and emphasizing those elements that are needed and actively pulling back or even straight up muting sources that are just not necessary for that performer to have on stage. I'll give a quick example here. Imagine a singer-songwriter who's playing acoustic guitar and singing in front of a full band. That singer-songwriter is the lead and essentially can just start playing and the band will play along with them. But they also need to hear some of the band, especially the drums, especially the bass player, so that they know that they are along with the band. Otherwise, why even have the band on stage? It's not fun. So you need to give them a little bit of that. And then that keyboard player is going to come in with that really cool harmony or counter melody during the chorus. Well, now they need to hear a little bit of that as well. That horn player is going to take a solo, and if they're not hearing that the solo's happening, they might play on top of it or sing on top of it or be confused about where the sections of the song go because we got a big chunk of silence. So they need little bits of these colors, but they don't need to be the forefront. The forefront needs to be, I need to hear my acoustic guitar and my voice over all of this stuff. So this is where it becomes extremely individual to the person who has the hearing loss and to the style of music and to the band. Because this might even change, this concept might even change song by song, or track by track, or performer by performer. Another thing that can help is just considering where the frequency real estate is being taken up. Low frequencies especially, it's important to keep those low frequencies for the instruments that need it, especially those who have reference for pitch. So bass instruments, rhythm instruments, save those low frequencies for those instruments. And I would encourage mixing engineers to experiment with low cut or high pass filters on more instruments and more aggressively than you ever would for front of house or for album mixing. when you're doing monitors for somebody with hearing loss. Same thing with high frequencies. It is important that those focal sources, such as the lead vocals and the lead instruments and the person's own instruments, have that air and space around them. And one way to give them that air and space is to remove those frequencies from instruments that don't necessarily need that spotlight to stand out in the front of the mix. Right. It can help things not feel buried and help them stand on top without making them too loud and uncomfortable for somebody with hearing loss.
That's amazing. What about someone who has an asymmetric hearing loss?
Asymmetric hearing loss is extremely tricky, probably the most tricky type of hearing loss here, because now you're not just mixing one audiogram for one type of hearing, but actually now we're dealing with separate hearing differences between each ear. Mm-hmm. If you were to pan something that the person needed over to their poorer hearing ear, it might just get lost. So we need to slow down and consider those asymmetries case by case. And if you're mixing for someone, talk with an artist about what is it that you're getting and what are you missing? Because it may not be evident to you if you're monitoring what they're hearing because they just have a different set of inputs.
So in the sense of a traditional mix management for someone with hearing loss, it does look like there are some solutions that we can actually incorporate to make things a little bit better at the minimum to ensure that the music is still going to have that impact.
Absolutely. And those solutions work for everyone, but especially for people with hearing loss. And in part 2 of this conversation, we're going to get into how to use the audiogram to inform your application of EQ and wide dynamic range compression or even limiting onto the mix. And then we'll talk at length about the different technological solutions that we hinted towards, the 3D ME, Aviom, self-mixing, and then more, let's call them DIY or creative solutions. For instance, I have a great example with a violinist who's monitoring himself through a pickup, through an earpiece, and other means of making sure that you can hear what you need to hear on stage, even if it's of a separate audio system than the rest of the band is dealing with. Great. So I look forward to having that conversation the second time. Go ahead and check out the article that we're talking about this. And if you have other main questions about how to manage hearing loss and manage hearing help for yourself or your artist who has hearing loss, we are always, what's the word? We're all ears. We're always listening.
Always listening. Yes.
Check out musicod.org to find an audiologist near you, and we'll be talking more about the directory of music audiologists, but we're all comfortable with this conversation and can support you along the way.
Thanks for taking the time to speak on this with us, Frank. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is a fun topic, and to everybody out there, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Talk to you next time. Talking Ears is a production of Earmark Hearing Conservation and Philadelphia Music Audiology. The show is proudly made by us humans, not AI, and this episode was produced by Juan Vasquez and Mary Kim, and the theme music is always by Scott Hallam. Talking Ears is a labor of love. It celebrates sound in all of its forms. Loudness can be fun, loudness can be interesting, and people with hearing loss should have exactly the same access to music making as everyone else. If you listened this far, I assume that you didn't mind what you heard. So I encourage you to share this with other folks who might be able to use this information. Please also continue sending in your questions for topics, your suggestions for guests. And if you're so inclined, you can send us some coffee money so we can keep awake and keep making this show. You're the reason we make this podcast. We love hearing from you. So as always, thanks for listening.